لهم حديد ونار لهم حديد ونار وهم من القش أضعف.
So this is an unusual episode of the Arab Tyrant Manual. It's unusual in a sense that we are interviewing each other about our book. I believe you have your copy of the book next to you, and I have mine here. Yep. In the previous episode, we had a repost from an interview that I did with Sarah Kendzior and Andrea Shalupa from the Gaslit Nation podcast. This interview, the earlier interview, was recorded about a year ago, maybe a little less than a year ago, before the book came out in the United States. But then it was an expansive interview about the book, about the context of the book, and we spoke also about the United States. It was one of my favorite interviews, to be honest. In this kind of follow-up episode about the book, The Middle East Crisis Factory, I think we're going to do something that is not done very often, in which the two co-authors of the book kind of interview each other about the book. It was an interesting process. It was a frustrating process. And, we've said many times to our audiences and even to ourselves that we don't want this to be the last book we write. But it was an unusual first book to write. And so I think what we're going to do here is that what we did ahead of time is prepare a list of questions. And, I prepared mine. I sent it to Ahmed. Ahmed worked on it a little bit. And now we're going to be basically going question, like I'm going to ask you a question and then you're going to ask me a question.
And these aren't exactly softball questions. I think we've both been specifically looking for the difficult ones and the revealing ones as well.
Yeah, to be honest, most of the time when I speak about my book, it's normally a short discussion. And it's a discussion that normally, because the book is about the Middle East and North Africa. It's called The Middle East Crisis Factory because it is about how dictatorships basically create crises. And how, it's not just a study of the present moment, but it's also a study of the history of legitimacy in the modern region. But because the region is always producing crises, there's always some crisis out there that whoever will interview you will want to focus on. So someone might interview you and say, okay, you wrote this book, but let's specifically talk about Yemen, or let's specifically talk about Saudi Arabia, etc. This is different here because we can actually go on tangents. We can actually, dive deep into maybe topics that the regular interview will not go into. So I'm kind of excited about this.
So why don't we kick off with motivations? Why did you write the book, Iyad?
So this is embarrassing. It's embarrassing because, as I said in the beginning of the book, in the very beginning of the book, I write this kind of introduction. Which is written by me and not by you, Ahmed, and in which I speak about how the book came to be. And the interesting thing is, the first thing I say is that this was not the book I was supposed to write. Back when we started working together, when we knew each other in 2011, I was working on a very different book. And I mentioned the whole story in the book. So if you've read the book, then you know. If not, buy the book and get to know the story. But essentially, there's another angle here, which is that when the way that it came about is that in 2015, I did an interview with I think it was Vox. And the interviewer there was asking me a few of my ideas about the region, etc. This was in the ISIS was still a thing at the time. Like the Caliphate was still a thing at the time. ISIS was not yet. Of course, ISIS is still around, but at that time it was really at the height of the scare. And based upon that interview, I was contacted by an Italian publisher, and La Terza, and they asked me to write a book. And they said, we want you to write a book that kind of, encapsulates some of the ideas that you cover in this interview. But the thing is, the interview was very expensive. I did not have the idea back then to write a book. But then, I'm an author. And this was, keep in mind that my personal situation at the time is that I didn't even have a home yet. I was still a refugee. I was not settled yet. I had been granted asylum by Norway, but I didn't have a place to, like a permanent place to stay. My family was in a bit of turmoil. And so I don't know if I should be ashamed to say this, but they lured me with money. I was a refugee who didn't have a job, and he didn't have a place to stay, and a publisher comes along to say, we're going to give you this advance to write this book. And
on that note, I think that it's kind of amusing to remember this, because of like now thinking back how small the advance was. Like it's not a particularly exciting sum, but we were that broke.
Yeah, the thing is, I think that if it was not for the advance, I probably would not have chosen to write the book then. I probably would have written it eventually, but not then. But then let me basically I kind of avoided the question here, because the question really was, once you decided to write the book, what was the motivation? So I went around the question here, but the motivation for writing the book really was to me, it was about the history of legitimacy in the region. There was a number of ideas that I wanted to put forward, and I didn't want to write a book which is completely political, because I thought that a political history will always privilege the stories of those in power. It will be about who's in power, what they did, etc. It will not be speaking about the people and how they lived. On the other hand, if we make it just a people's history, and we ignore, a cultural history, for example, or social history, a lot of the time we would be ignoring the relationship between these people and those in power. And the politics, after all, especially if you live in a dictatorship, it really decides a lot of what happens in your life. So for me, I really wanted to write about the history of legitimacy, because I thought legitimacy is that one thing that ties the two. It ties those in power with the people who are governed. And I wanted to really explain that the Arab Spring was not just a moment in time, that it's a phase of our history, and that this is my vision for what's going to, what the next 20 years will look like. So that's my answer. And let me ask you the next question. Why did you set out to write the book? I mean, what was your motivation? And did your motivation change as, during the process of writing it?
So I don't have an interesting story about how I was chased from country to country during the course of preparing to write the book. But I do have an intellectual answer to where it came from. As you know, I was just coming out of my teens when the uprisings of the region happened or began. And I was watching with frustration and, kind of amazed at the incompetence with which Western powers treated the entire question of policy and how to respond. And you know how sometimes with the eyes of a beginner, you come to a question with more innocence and you can kind of forego the answers which are taken as foregone conclusions and actually look at the real root of the question instead of dealing with legacy issues and things like that.
No, explain that point a little bit further.
So sometimes when you've been in a field for a long time, you have all kinds of additional considerations weighing on you at the same time as the work that you're actually doing. You're thinking of how this fits with the legacy of how you've dealt with the issue before. You're thinking about continuity. You're thinking about institutions and how they react. You're thinking about relationships. You have a lot of received wisdom that you're trying to work within. And you've gotten used to thinking about the issue a certain way. And maybe the correct answer is actually outside of the way you've always thought about it. And I thought maybe this was an opportunity to really look at the question from first principles. And I guess that's kind of what we did, because we started with the historical narrative, and we went from that to society and how society works and why society works that way. And from that, we tried to figure out solutions to the questions of authoritarianism, foreign intervention, and extremism in the region. We didn't start with here's what everybody does to deal with terrorist groups, or here's how we've always dealt with dictatorships in the past. Here's the Bush doctrine, or here's the Reagan doctrine, or whatever. We kind of approached it as a blank slate, and in a way that gave us possibly more freedom than people who work in the field professionally.
Mm. Well, that's very interesting. I was like, as you're speaking, I was actually thinking about how my own motivation changed, because I mean, not that I have anything interesting to say. It's just that the book was not written in a single year, because the first draft of it, I mean, I signed the contract. It was, I think, 2016, and then it was written in bits and pieces over the next 2 years. And then, of course, I think we're going to go over the story, because eventually it was published in Italian the first time, and then it was translated and it expanded into English, which made it a different book. And because of the very large events and this like very traumatic transition going on in the Middle East, different years have had different topics, different emphases. And so there are layers of the book, and I think you wanted to ask me about this, about the first book.
Yeah, which was originally called The Vicious Triangle.
Yeah.
And anyone who's read the book now knows that that's more like the first half of the book.
Yeah, in the original manuscript, that was right now it is one chapter of the book. Of the Middle East Crisis Factory. Initially, it was actually an entire part of the book. In the previous, the initial, The Vicious Triangle. The Vicious Triangle was the title of the book, and it was one of the main themes of the book. And the idea here was to talk about this kind of this relationship, this interdependence between terrorism, dictatorship, and foreign intervention. I was fascinated with that for a very long time. I tweeted a lot about it for a very long time. I discussed with a lot of people, and I thought it was an interesting idea to examine this kind of interdependence, and how three oppressive forces can kind of lean into each other, because they appear to be fighting each other, but they actually empower each other. And I thought that was very fascinating. And the first version of the book really focused on that a lot. Keep in mind that, as I mentioned earlier, the book was initially commissioned when the biggest story was really terrorism and ISIS, and so it had a certain it had a certain focus on terrorism, how terrorism fits into the cycle, and how dictatorship and foreign intervention kind of feed into that. But I guess let me ask you the next question. When you were writing your chapters of the book, were you trying to influence policy?
I think I was less towards the end of the book. And I think we both converged on that. And I think I was a lot more at the beginning. I was very optimistic about it. And now, looking back, that feels like a very distant goal. You can talk about Western foreign policy as being a massive juggernaut. And because of all that weight, it's so slow to turn around. There's so many well-meaning people and people of integrity and people who are involved for the right reasons involved in it. And many of them have listened to us and spoken to us and consulted us in the past. But they're also fighting against so many entrenched interests, not to mention an electoral system which kind of disincentivizes long-term thinking about these problems anyway. There's nobody really whose job it is at a high enough level to think about the 10 years and the 20 years. The people who call the shots are thinking about the 4 years and the 8 years. And as the crises rolled while we were writing this book, it kind of spanned multiple eras. It spanned the the last years of the initial revolutionary movements. It spanned the backlash against them from the authoritarians, and then the rise of ISIS, and then the global intervention and the fall of ISIS. And I think that seeped in to the attitude writing it, and we began to care less and less about policy, or maybe even believe less and less that we could affect policy. How about you?
Well, for me, initially, I did have a focus on policy. Initially, I thought that this could be. I mean, I remember some of the first manuscript that I wrote, and I was writing about how this was in 2016. Trump was basically sworn in, and I could also see that for us, of course, Trump was a disaster. But at the same time, we also knew that Hillary was not exactly a friend. It seemed that in the foreign policy department, these democracies, all the rage in 2016 was about defending democracy, authoritarian backlash, the rise of populism, etc. But then from our vantage point, yeah, we cared about democracy, but at the same time, we're like, your foreign policy has never been pro-democracy. And so I was thinking, the world does not know how to deal with dictatorships. The world does not really know how to stand up for democracy. And especially the Western world, especially Western progressives, they might be progressives on many issues, but when it comes to foreign policy, they don't really have a lot of new ideas. So I thought that maybe we can present kind of a policy prescription saying that, we're from the region, we care deeply about the region, we care about democracy, we care about human rights, and this is a prescription for what we think can work. So, and you can understand, I mean, this is, of course, makes complete sense, but by the end of it, I started to see that I was maybe I got disillusioned. I got disillusioned with whether any book or really any effort can actually turn this around, because I thought that this dissociation, between foreign policy, between values and foreign policy, is really intergenerational. I thought that there's no point for us to actually try to prescribe, like to basically suggest policy. I thought that it's simply not worth it, because a lot of these countries, whether it is in Europe or in the United States, they are becoming inward focused. They are focused on internal kind of contradictions. And whether we like it or not, whether we accept it or not, this is not going to be a priority for them for a while. And so my focus shifted. And honestly, it's also, there is a bit of also disillusionment with where the source of the problem is. I don't think, where I am now, I don't think the source of the problem is policy. I think the source of the problem is that for many people in the West, they simply, and I say this with a little bit of bitterness, really, I don't think they see the region as worth investment. Or let me say it bluntly, I don't think they see us as full human beings. I think our fate is always going to be of not of very high importance. And so there's this idea that this region is uniquely, a bed for crises. It's uniquely bad, and it's uniquely not worth of long term. Because if we're going to go there and say, listen, this is going to take 20 years, yeah, for me and you, it means, yeah, this is going to take 20 years of our lives, and we have to work towards it, towards something which is worth it, and it is worth the investment of of a big chunk of our lives, if not the rest of our lives. But for a Western policymakers, 20 years, that means that we might as well get chummy with the dictators because they're going to be around for 20 years. This is how their thinking is going to be. So I guess it was disillusionment, or maybe realism. I don't know. But let me ask you the next question. Why was this difficult to write for you?
So the parts that I spent the most time on, I think, were chapter 2 is the vicious triangle, and that has a bunch of case studies in it. Each angle of the triangle, basically terrorism and tyranny, terrorism and foreign intervention and tyranny. We have one case study in each direction of how one angle of the triangle supported the other.
Yeah, so let me ask you, let me interject and ask you to kind of explain a little bit more for someone who hasn't read the book and doesn't know about the vicious triangle, what it is.
Yeah, so basically it's the idea that these three forces, authoritarianism, foreign intervention, and extremism, aren't separate, independent things that can be fought independently. They're deeply symbiotic and they're intertwined with each other, and you can't get rid of one without addressing the others. And they're symbiotic to the extent that if you try and remove one using another, they will actually mutually reinforce each other.
So that is to say, yeah. So that is to say, for example, if you try to fight terrorism through foreign intervention, you're actually strengthening terrorism.
Yeah, and the specific case study that we used for that one is Iraq post the Gulf War, and how basically the US and Europe's efforts to stamp out extremism just created a hotbed for extremism, from which eventually emerged horrors that hadn't yet been seen before in the region, like, eventually ISIS, but even before them, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi and others like him.
Mm.
So the difficult part of this was, as I was writing these chapters, I was going into, source material. I was looking at primary sources, but also secondary sources and analysis. But I was also trying to mine the stories from within my own family, and I uncovered a lot of stuff that I wasn't even aware of before that. And it really connected me to the anger of previous generations and made me empathize in a way that I hadn't before. So one example I was thinking about earlier is Gamal Abdel Nasser, the Egyptian military strongman, and the first really big military leader in the region, arguably. And I've always looked back at him as a complete catastrophe for the region and a failure. And I've looked at him with, probably disgust is the best word. Military dictator who decimated his own civil society and dragged the country through a couple of disastrous, failed military conflicts before bequeathing the country to another military ruler when he was assassinated. And when I spoke to my family, I actually saw the rise of Gamal Abdel Nasser through their eyes. You have my grandfather growing up. The occupation of Egypt by the British is still within living memory, right? And the occupation of Libya by Italy is within living memory. And most of the region, likewise, Syria, French occupation, almost the entire region apart from Saudi Arabia, maybe. And all of a sudden, there's this handsome, charismatic military man getting rid of the government which used to kowtow to foreigners and speaking strongly about native dignity and agency and talking big about how we're going to defend ourselves and now it's going to be different. So initially, I was really surprised when I found out that members of my family had basically canvassed for him, gone around, in Libya handing out leaflets, talking about the Arab nationalist socialist cause, driving around the neighborhood with megaphones, spreading the message. I was really amazed to hear that. And then when I saw it through their eyes, you kind of get a very different view of the situation at the time. Today, we can say that people don't have the excuse because we know exactly what happens when you bring in a military leader. But back then, this was a totally new experiment. We were getting rid of centuries of rule by outsiders and, bring up a young, charismatic guy who believes in native agency. And it was an era of incredible hope. And of course, after that, I also heard about how seeing that decline felt as it happened, watching it unfold live and how it affected people, how it affected communities and society.
You mean the Naksa, the defeat of 1967?
The Naksa, the downturn in Libya, watching the slide of Saddam, Palestine through successive crises, watching what the rulers of Saudi Arabia eventually became. A lot of it was kind of sleepwalking into it. But you basically woke up 30 years later and with horror and thought, what has this region become? We were so young and hopeful, and now it's a catastrophe. So that was very difficult emotionally to connect with for me.
Yeah, and we tried to capture that in the book itself when we talked about, this was part of the story of legitimacy itself, and how legitimacy went from, we're going to fight imperialism, to more mundane things like education and healthcare and a better lifestyle.
So that's something that came. I think another thing that changed through the course of the book is, as I leaned less on the policy side, I started to lean more on the story that I wanted to tell about our own existence, where we came from, and our aspirations. And I think it's possibly something you can. Well, it's very hard to get it from academic or historical sources, is how the event really made people feel on a visceral level.
And that kind of, I know that you wanted to ask me why I included poetry in the early drafts, and I think that answers it, really. I think there's going to be a short answer. I mean, I kind of preempted your question. You were supposed. I knew that this was going to be the next question. I kind of jumped on it. But the reason why, I mean, in early drafts, of course, we couldn't include all of the poetry because some of the translations were copyrighted, and we couldn't really include it. But the reason why is because I think it's probably a good thing that a lot of these events were documented in popular culture in a very extensive way. Every time one of those big events happened in the region, there was poems written about it, there were songs written about it, on both sides. Sometimes it is a matter of bitterness, sometimes a matter of pride. But then there's a lot, and the other side of that disillusionment, like you said, this idea that we're sleepwalking into a lot of crises and disappointments, and 30 years later we find this this beautiful dream has become a nightmare. The other side of it is that from pain comes a lot of, to be honest, really, really, really poignant, and I'd even say beautiful poetry. And I thought that including the poetry really will connect you with the sense, with the visceral feelings of people who are going through that.
So did you find anything particularly difficult to write about?
Yeah, I mean, because I remember once writing to our editor to just to just explain to her just how difficult writing. I think I just wanted to speak to someone about the process, and sometimes because you're writing the book from kind of it's a bird's eye view of the events, both regionally, like geographically, but also chronologically. And sometimes I have to write single sentences about a whole event that happened that took that involved a lot of people dying, a lot of people I know, people I know personally, people I'm connected with. So writing some of the chapters was definitely triggering. It was triggering because I had to put myself in my shoes as I was going through the events. It made for powerful writing, but it was very difficult. It was very, very difficult.
Particularly given you were still at the height of your PTSD during a lot of this process, it probably didn't help.
Yeah, I mean, I actually considered writing this at the end of the book to say that I wrote this book while recovering from PTSD, because it was something that I was very proud of, honestly. And one of the earlier editor, the editor of the Visual Triangles, like maybe that's not relevant. But now I'm wondering, maybe I should have mentioned it, just kind of as a point of pride.
There's definitely blood, sweat, and tears that went into it.
Yeah, and that's the thing. It was a very unusual process. I'm going to ask you the next question.
Okay.
And I'll try not to jump on the next question, so that you can ask it. What do you like about the book, and what do you not like about the book?
So connected to the last answer, but I really like the fact that it's telling the story of a people, and that there are so many different countries, but we managed to weave them into an overarching narrative of the region, whilst at the same time not erasing the diversity and the difference within that region. I don't think anyone would get the impression from reading it that all these countries are the same, and each case study you get the fact that there's a very particular dynamic going on here and its own particularities, but at the same time there's an overarching story. And what I didn't like, aside from the process, which was very difficult, I think it was everything that I didn't like was related to process. At times I found it very difficult to keep up with you. So we're kind of opposite ends of a generation, 15 years apart. You had more experience than me. And you had, like, we both had, I think, at different times a clear idea of what we wanted, and it was sometimes a stretch to harmonize those things together. But looking back, I'm very satisfied with how the result turned out. How about you?
Well, I would say that I liked what I liked about the book is really the opportunity to sit with this material, the opportunity to really do this kind of deep dive. I like the idea also. I really appreciate the chance to write about the story of legitimacy. I think that was, and I think I also liked the last chapter that I wrote. Kind of looking ahead, looking forward, with a bit of
the next 20 years.
The next 20 years, and I think I also ended on a positive note and a humanistic note, a note of hope. What I did not like, and I think this might surprise some people, but in private conversations, I've mentioned to people that I was surprised that the book came out as good as it did, because in certain ways I feel like I censored myself in certain parts of the book, especially earlier drafts, which earlier drafts became the layer upon which the rest of the book was written. So I think this is the main thing. It's that I thought that I could. I mean, if I write the book anew, if I'm going to write the book now, I think it's going to be more honest. It might be more angry, but it's going to be more honest.
Tell me more about that.
I think it's a function of my recovery from PTSD. I'm gonna go off on a bit of a tangent here, but I remember coming back home from my first my first round of psychedelic therapy in the United States in 2018. This was after the Jamal Khashoggi murder, and people generally after their first therapies, they have a feeling of calm and they have a feeling of centeredness, and they feel in control. But I remember a feeling of anger. And the anger, as I spoke to my facilitator and my therapist at the time, and they were surprised. They're like, this is interesting. But now I understand it, because when you have lived in a situation where you are constantly being targeted, or you're basically facing constant repeated humiliation because of who you are. Sometimes the way that recovery is going to look is that you're going to see at things which you normalized to yourself. You thought they were normal, but suddenly you start to see them as not normal at all. And that's when you start to be angry. This anger is basically self-respect. You're gaining self-respect, and as you gain self-respect, you actually learn to be angry again. It's not necessarily bad. Of course, I mean, anger can become bad if it's consuming and if it's egotistical. But in this case, it's actually a positive sign. So I think that I have one of the things that I hope that I've done, I think I'm still working on it, is really to reconcile myself with the sense of anger, because anger is the right response. It's the right human response to injustice. So I think this is.
I think we've said that before, that if you're not angry about the region, you don't actually understand what's happening,
or you don't care.
Yeah.
Yeah. And of course, that's not an option we have.
So, which part of the book's most important to you?
Um, I think I would say the history of legitimacy, which is the first part of the book, was I found it important to me because I thought that I really thought that I communicated what I had to say. I feel that the vicious triangle. So there's a bit of context to whoever is listening to us about the vicious triangle, because it used to be, as I mentioned, it used to be very big. It used to be 3 chapters or 4 chapters, was it? And then it had to be summarized into one. It is by far still the longest chapter of the book, but it used to be, I think, I think it was 20,000 words or something like that.
That summarizing was a painful process.
Yes, painful because you had to cut away a lot of the stuff that you already wrote. And
A
now
lot
what
of
we're
stuff
thinking,
that I really liked, and that was I
and
thought
it was, and that's why we're thinking this is still on the books, and it's a project that we're likely going to be working on 2022, which is to take that material and turn it into kind of a series or kind of like a limited release podcast, because that is, I mean, absolutely, it is good material. It is actually well edited. It all just needs to be put out there. We just had to cut it out for that reason. But still, even though we had to cut so much, I think the Vicious Triangle, those chapters came out good. They came out. I mean, they really portray the central message there. Um, I would say that I regret that I could not write more about Palestine, or I could not really fit Palestine into the history of legitimacy, because Palestine had a very different path in the last 70 years than the rest of the region because of the occupation, because we're facing something very different than what people in Mauritania or people in Algeria or people in Yemen are facing. But then I always thought that this book is about the region, and in the future there's going to be chances for us to write more about this is I don't want to uncover what we're already working on, but we are working on a big project related to Palestine anyway. I did not really. I think I also like the last portion of the book. I mentioned that the last 20 years. The part about the proposals, the part about the ideas about what to do. I thought that I'm not gonna say that I don't like these parts, but I'm just gonna say that I don't think that the main problem with Western foreign policy regarding the Middle East is a lack of imagination. I don't think it's a problem of lack of imagination. I think it's a lack of political will, which is why I wouldn't overemphasize. I mean, a lot of people's like, okay, these are some ideas. Honestly, I would not emphasize the ideas so much, because I don't think it's a matter of lack of ideas. I think it's simply a lack of, political will. I'm gonna ask you the next question, and if you had to write the book today, I mean, if you have to start writing now, someone asks you for a book proposal, how would it be different?
I don't know what I'd do in a new book proposal, but if I was writing this book again, I think what I'd do is include a lot more stories of the people who were crushed between the wheels of the grand geopolitical machines that tore through the region and whose stories were never told. I think that's where the book comes alive. I think, like, for example, the story of Muhammad Sultan in the chapter on Egypt. It's such an incredible story. It's almost like the guy's. I think he's my age, and he already seems to have lived 3 lifetimes. People like him, people like my grandfather. There's so many of them. People like Jamal Khashoggi. I think I would have possibly tried to tell a lot more of it through the eyes of individual stories, rather than as 60,000 feet out, bird's eye view kind of things. How about you?
I mean, interesting that you'd say that, because that would be, that would be a good idea for another book, I guess. But it'll be a very different book, because it's basically highlighting stories. And yeah, we tried to, you try to maintain this humanity in the narrative, but at the same time, you need to speak about very general things. I mean, for me, I guess I would probably not have the ambition to talk about solutions or to talk about proposals. And I would simply expand the parts which talk about the history, and like you mentioned, those personal stories. And maybe I'll be very explicit about why there is this function, why I think that it's not going to be very productive for me to speak about proposals.
So who do you want this book to be read by? The book that we actually have.
I mean, I would imagine giving the book to read. I mean, sometimes you're having an argument, you're having a debate with someone, and you feel that, oh, this person doesn't understand where I'm coming from. And I would say, here, read this book and you'll understand. We had many conversations with the publisher, with Hearst, before actually starting the process. And the idea that they wanted is that they wanted a book which was not specialist. I mean, not so specialized that it's only something that's read by experts, but also, it should be a book that an expert will read and will get something out of, knowing that this is not an academic book. But then also a general audience can read. It's still accessible to a general audience, and they'll still get something out of it. And it will not be, it's not so dumbed down that experts will not be interested in it, and it's not so inaccessible that general public will say that this is not something for us. So I guess my ambition is for this book to really be that way, to really be a book that can anybody can read, get to understand a little bit about the region, and get to understand a little bit about how we think about the region, and get something out of it. So let me ask you this: beyond the details of the content, what do you think? I mean, what do you think? What do you want the reader to walk away having understood?
So to me, the thing that really sticks out is the fact that the region did not have to be the way that it is, and there's nothing inherent about it saying that it has to be this way. It's this way because of the choices that people have made, and we can make different choices very easily. That's, I guess, the key message of the book for me. I was thinking about your answer to who you want this book to be read by, and wondering who I'd love to read it. And the first people that came to mind are actually my family in Libya. I'd love to get a translated version someday, because I almost feel like it would be like holding up a mirror in a way. And I'd love to ask, do you see yourself in this? Do you see your hopes, or your hopes from back in the 70s or the 50s? Do you see them reflected? Do you still hold them? Do you disavow them? And what would you do differently? And what can we do differently now? Because that idea that the region didn't have to be this way is something that's really important for Western observers. It wipes away a lot of the Orientalism, but I think it's also important for ourselves from the region, because there's a level of even self-loathing that can come with being from such a broken and dysfunctional region, that you think it's because of who you are. Like, it's your fault that your country is this broken and this bad.
Yeah, and I certainly sympathize with that, because I grew up around communities that had this sense of biting humor, kind of like self-deprecating humor about. It's really coming from pain. It's coming from disillusionment and pain, from 2 generations, 3 generations of pain. And here to say that I'm actually asking myself, why didn't I think about that this book can be for Arabic-speaking audiences? And I guess I grew up in the region. This is maybe another distinction. It's not only that we have this age difference between me and you, but also I grew up in the region, and you grew up in, of course, a very Arab family, but you grew up in the United Kingdom, and so we have different perspectives here as well. I always felt, and I don't know if I'm correct to think that, but I felt that a lot of my perspective is something that a lot of Arabs within the region will not need to be told. I mean, it's that kind of stuff. It's the kind of thing that they already know. maybe it's a wrong assumption. Maybe it is a very wrong assumption. Maybe we should be thinking, this is a book that maybe it's a book that should be translated. Of course, the whole idea about translation to Arabic opens another discussion that I think is worth its own episode of the Arab Tyrant Manual, because it will be banned. But maybe if it's banned or censored, that actually is the best advertisement.
And I'd actually say that even if people would instinctively agree, and this isn't something that they need to be told, sometimes it's just healing to be able to see how you feel in writing, and especially in a highly censored region, to know that you're not the only one. I'm going to steal one of your questions here. But if this book is the start of a conversation, what would you want that conversation to be?
Honestly, it'll depend upon who I'm having the conversation with. So if I'm having a conversation with a fellow Middle Easterner, it's going to be about self-discovery, about understanding how we got here, about understanding, like you said, that a lot of the conflicts within the region were not inevitable, and they're not essential to the region. And from there it becomes a conversation about the future, about what we can do, and about the fact that we can do something. It's not exactly. Sometimes you have these conversations and people just check out and again, when they check out, it's not because they don't care. It's because they care so much that they don't want to hurt themselves. If, however, the conversation is with someone who's from outside the region, especially from Western country, and I keep highlighting Western country because Western countries, of course, have had a very deep and really terrible impact on the region. I think that conversation would be again about how, kind of really trying to make them understand the region from the eyes of a native, and how from the eyes of a native, a lot of these events that they had a different perspective on had a very different interpretation, very different meaning. And I guess it's going to always revolve around shared humanity, about humanism, about the fact that this region is a region of human beings. I think I mentioned this in the book at some point, that to start to talk about how to fix the region is to understand that it's you don't fix a human being, you don't fix a human organic thing, you heal it. And if we're going to speak about healing, it starts really with integrating our history. I'm going to ask you the same question. I mean, if this was a conversation, then where would you take this conversation?
I liked your answer about agency, and I don't think I can find a better one. Basically, what we can do, and whether I think that would be the same whether in the region or outside of it, because the answers would be different, but the starting question is the same. Within the region, it's really about recapturing that hope, and that ability to look forward to the future and feel that you can play a part in building it. And outside of the region, it's also about not accepting things as a foregone conclusion, and accepting that you can play a role, whether that's through involvement in the political process or just showing solidarity.
I mean, it's a weird. It is. I mean, I started the episode by saying there's going to be an unusual interview, but I thought there's going to be unusual for the reader. Sorry, for the listener. But it's also weird for us, because it's almost like, these are deep questions that are really making you reach deep inside to understand your own motivations. But I'm gonna let's end with probably the most uncomfortable question. What worries you as an author about this book?
That's a difficult question. Do you want to go first?
Well, this tells you that we really did good work on picking the questions. But yeah, what worries me about it is, I mean, let me tell you what worries me from the point of view of an author. I keep worrying about falling into the crack between the expert crowd and the general audience. Because you want to be in that sweet spot where you're like, okay, an expert can appreciate the book, but it's also accessible for general audiences, as I mentioned. But then you don't want to fall in the crack where an expert will say this is too general for me, and the general audience will say this is too expert for me. I also worry about people who would read the book and would simply focus on the implementation policy. What do we do? When it's really about giving you a paradigm, giving you a way of understanding the human beings in the region, the 500 million human beings who deserve better. I also worry about speaking about the region, because it's like I mentioned, it's a large region and it's many countries and it's a lot of people, it's lots of different ethnicities, cultures, etc. I keep worrying about, because whenever you tell a story, you tell a big story, you're also missing a lot of small stories. You're missing nuances and details and niches. And I keep worrying about us having made some mistakes in this zooming in and out, and we didn't do justice to certain communities or certain stories or certain perspectives within the region, of certain people within the region who would deserve better. I think that would be my answer, and I'd like to hear yours, of course.
Yeah, I guess there's the worry about having used too broad a brush. And maybe particularly people within the region, would feel like their perspective was unfairly grouped with others which were different, or their story was unfairly included in others which were different. And that is a sensitivity. I guess my biggest concern would be whether it's enough, to be honest, whether we told the story well enough, whether we went deep enough into it, whether I gave enough voice to previous generations, whether the book carries the aspirations that we wanted it to carry. And I know the answer, of course, and the answer is it'll never be enough. And that's why we didn't call it a day upon finishing the book. We're still working.
Yeah, and I mean it's worth as an ending note here, it's worth talking about what comes next. My perspective, of course, is that we're going to work more on promoting the book. We have not done that enough for multiple reasons. One of them is that the UK release and the American release were basically 6 months apart, and that kind of confused the promotion schedule a bit. But also COVID makes everything complicated. In another world, we would be able to do a book tour and we'll be able to do book signings and stuff, and kind of waiting. Every time we say, okay, this pandemic is going to be over now and this is the last wave, and then we get slammed with another wave. But luckily, a lot of the book is kind of evergreen material, especially the historical part, and I think it will always be. Working on promoting it, even if it's been nearly 6 months now since the American release, I think it's still worth it. So I think I would like just to continue to be working on that. I also noticed that in my own notes, sometimes I take notes and I tag them as Middle East Crisis Factory, as though I am writing an update to the book. Even though I don't think I'm going to write an update to the book. I think maybe there's space for us to do some kind of follow-ups as a podcast, as a newsletter or something like that. It's worth looking into. But I think the biggest thing that I would be looking forward to is releasing the original Vicious Triangle, the original, you mostly worked on it. That's mostly your work. Basically releasing that as kind of a limited release podcast.
Yeah, and the original notes for that have so much that was cut, not just in terms of stories, but also in terms of references. Like, we went really deep. We had never done this before, so we didn't know how the process worked. So, we were documenting every single event that had occurred, in some cases as it occurred, because we were writing about things that were still unfolding. Like, one example of that is the story, the case study on tyranny and terrorism. We used Bashar al-Assad and ISIS. And I was writing about basically the evidence of collaboration between the two. And pretty much until we sent the book off, I was still gathering evidence of, the really flagrant evidence that both had deliberately aided and abetted each other. And that it's quite an archive. Most of the sources didn't make it in, but it's quite an archive.
Yeah, I think I still have a Google document somewhere with full of material, full of links and just evidence. In the end, you're like, I can't include all of that evidence. I have to tell a story in the end. Yeah, I look forward to the next chapter, I guess. It was not an easy book to write, and the process was absolutely nuts. I hope that our future collaborations are not going to be as chaotic, and they're not going to happen under such severe personal circumstances. But I think we did a good job, and I hope that I hope that the whatever comes next is also going to live up to the expectations.
Thanks for listening to that Arab Tyrant Manual podcast. Episodes are currently releasing every other Friday, so if you're listening to this on release, catch you in another 2 weeks. If you're looking for something sooner than that, then check out our new podcast, Intergalactic Tarbosh. It's a weekly short-form podcast where we talk about random things from social change in the public sphere to why Iyad hates koalas so much. You can support us by leaving us a review on whichever app you listen to your podcasts on, or giving us a like on YouTube. You can also support us on Patreon, where our audience support plays a massive role in making sure our team at Kawakibi Foundation can keep doing what we do. Catch you next time.
كتابا من كل قلب تألف